Welcome to the Mortimer History Society's conference on Wales and its role in the Wars of the Roses. Delighted to have you here and delighted to welcome our speakers. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Stephen David. He is absolutely an expert in this field of Wales in the Wars of the Roses. His book, The Birth of the Red Dragon, Wales and the Wars of the Roses, is just published, out in September. And in his talk, he's going to track how, during that crucial period from 1450 to 1461, the gentry of Wales became polarised between the houses of York and Lancaster, leading to their embroilment in civil war. As Stephen puts it, it was during this time that the road to the Battle of Mortimer's Cross was mapped. So please join me in welcoming Stephen David. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I think if we were to start looking at where the road to Mortimer's Cross began, it would be in the early days of September 1450, when Richard, Duke of York, alighted at Denbigh, having returned from becoming the governor of Ireland. His return was somewhat unexpected and unwanted by the government of Henry VI, and particularly Henry's household, who up until that point had been convulsed in the chaos of the Cade rebellion. But having suppressed that, they then found the unwanted assistance of Richard, Duke of York. York marched on London in that autumn with over 3,000 men. And those 3,000 men came largely from the marches, but were led by York's Chamberlain, Sir William Oldhall, who had been York's Chamberlain since the 1430s, when York had served in France. They arrived in London, and York brought a petition towards Parliament on the 3rd of December, in which he asked for the removal of 29 people from about the presence of the king. The top of the list of those 29 people was the Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort, the king's cousin, and York's successor as Lieutenant of Normandy and France. Somerset had had a tortuous time in France and had presided over the liquidation of all of Henry V's conquests and the final expulsion of the English from Normandy and France, apart from Calais, which Somerset had been able to defend over the summer of 1450. York insinuated that France had been lost because of Somerset's blatant incompetence, if not his traitorous intentions. And he desired that he would be removed, as I say, from the government of Henry VI and banned from any presence about the king. He did also want Alice Chaucer removed, the widow of William de la Pole, and a whole range of other people. This was exacerbated on the 3rd of December also by York's steward, Thomas Young, bringing forth a petition to Parliament before the Commons that York should be made Henry VI's official heir. This was because, at this point, Henry, having been married for 5 years to Margaret of Anjou, had failed to produce an heir, and it was felt that within the chaos of the realm, the establishment of an heir was a political necessity. This was seen as a blatant intrusion in the Commons into, effectively, the royal prerogative, and rejected both by the king and by the Lords. Somerset himself was not present at Parliament at this point, and therefore missed, in the early part of 1451, York making overt political attacks on Somerset, which he now saw as someone who wished to effectively exclude York and his bloodline from any form of participation in the governance of England. York, in doing so, became more and more politically isolated, as the rest of the nobility saw York not so much as establishing a concern for the public weal, but more that York himself was actually someone who was looking for his own political interests. Those political interests were seen to be graphically expressed by the personal divisions and the personal attacks that York continued to make throughout 1451. In the summer of 1451, York took it upon himself to intervene in the siege of Taunton Castle during a feud in the West Country between the Earl of Devon and Lord Bonville, principally to support his one political ally, the Earl of Devon. But ultimately, through the rest of the autumn, York was effectively isolated and forced to return to his castle for the first time at Ludlow. There, he ruminated over the winter until on the 9th of January 1452, York wrote to his cousin Henry VI and actually swore his undying fidelity and his loyalty to the king. This was in some ways, though, very disingenuous of York, because he was already planning another attempt on the removal of his rival, the Duke of Somerset. Because on the 3rd of February at Shrewsbury, he published 3 petitions which required not only that the king should dismiss the Duke of Somerset, but that Edmund Beaufort should be tried for treason and placed before the Lords as effectively a felon of the realm. York was prepared to back this up by publishing these manifestos in all of his towns, Bridgewater, Hitchin, Stamford, Grantham, and other elements that he owned to try and muster popular support for his cause. He'd made a political miscalculation, though, on the fact that Parliament not sitting meant that there was very little public arena for him to display his concern for the public weal and the greater good of the realm. And ultimately, his march on London and his announcement of his intentions resulted in him becoming isolated before the King's army at Dartford.
Stephen, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment. Sorry, but I think we've lost your screen sharing. We can't see your slides at the moment.
No, I haven't put one up yet.
Ah, okay, sorry.
Sorry about that. On the 2nd of March, York, in one of the great one of the great events of 1452, is brought before Henry and his royal tent at Dartford, having been promised by his brother-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury, and his nephew, the Earl of Warwick, that his principal enemy, the Duke of Somerset, wasn't present. When York is brought into the king's presence, there he finds Somerset at his customary position close to the king. Feeling tricked, York is forced to then submit once more to the king. He's placed in the care of the Bishop of London and taken to the Bishop of London's palace, where he, on the 30th of March, is bound over to keep the peace for a surety of the enormous sum of £20,000. Released from the king's presence and from London, he retires to Ludlow, where he can ruminate on his isolation and political impotence. Over a period of 18 months, York had made 2 attempts to force his way into the presence of the king's government, and on both those occasions, he'd been rebuffed. However, for York, an ally was to come about from an unlikely source. In 1452, in the summer of 1452, the Earl of Warwick had very much been in the king's camp. That changed, though, over that summer. Warwick, born in 1428, at the age of 21, on the 10th of June 1449, had, through the right of his wife, inherited the earldom of Warwick, a magnificent amalgamation of noble estates comprising of 80 lordships and manors in 18 counties, and including the significant Welsh lordships of Glamorgan and Abergavenny. Warwick's possession of the Warwick and Despencer inheritance had been altogether simple. Warwick's wife, Anne, was the full sister of the last Beauchamp Duke or Earl of Warwick, who had died in 1446. Henry, Duke of Warwick, had left a child, but she had died at the age of 5, leaving Warwick's wife, Anne, as his closest female heir. However, Anne's sole possession of the estate was challenged by her 3 elder sisters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Elizabeth. Margaret, Eleanor, and Elizabeth all anticipated by a legal codicil sharing in the Warwick inheritance. That, through the courts, had been rejected in early 1450. This had resulted in Warwick, so famous Ladybird published a book on him, becoming the sole heir of the Beauchamps and the Despensers, and effectively disinheriting his 3 elder sister-in-laws. That was fine in 1450. In 1451, 1452, though, circumstances had changed. In 1450, Margaret the Elder had been married to the Earl of Shrewsbury, John Talbot, who was a prisoner of the French. Eleanor had been married to Edmund, Duke of Somerset, and Somerset had been engaged in the disasters of Formigny and the defence of Calais, whilst Elizabeth was married to Warwick's uncle, Lord Latimer, who seems to have had some sort of mental impairment because Warwick's father, Salisbury, looked after his affairs because it was said he is an idiot. In 1451, Edmund Beaufort begins to challenge Warwick for the control of the Warwick inheritance. Beaufort, or Somerset, was the most significant loser with the loss of Lancastrian property in France. He'd been someone who'd made his career in France, being occupied in French affairs from 1428 up until 1450. And the reason for this was he held principal estates in Normandy as the Count of Mortimer, but very, very limited estates in England. In fact, the Beaufort family estate had descended almost entirely to his niece, the young Margaret Beaufort, after the death of his brother John in 1445. But having married Eleanor, the middle sister, Somerset hoped to obtain part of the Warwick inheritance. In fact, it was probably a necessity for him, since he had 10 children to provide for, a ducal title, and an income of only about £300, which would have made him a modest baron rather than a knight. Somerset saw the ability of the partition of the Warwick inheritance to create for him a country, as it were, and a noble estate, because since 1435, Somerset had had a range of offices in South Wales. If you look at this map, the area covered in brown, which is the county of Carmarthen in the Southern Principality, was an area in which Somerset retained all of the principal offices and was Constable of Carmarthen Castle, Cardigan Castle, and Aberystwyth Castle. He was also steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, which gave him control over the sub-lordship of Ogmore in the middle of Glamorgan, and the lordship of Monmouth and three castles in the east. If he challenged Warwick for a partition of the Beauchamp inheritance, he could link the territories in which he held an office and a life interest with those territories that Warwick held of the lordships of Glamorgan and Abergavenny. In fact, these lordships were extremely valuable for any person who held them, amounting to an income of about £2,100 per annum, over £1,500 for Glamorgan and over £600 for Abergavenny at that time. And there is some evidence that Warwick's control over Glamorgan wasn't entirely as firm as he would like it, because there seems to have been some rejection of Warwick's new steward, William Herbert, who'd been appointed sometime in 1449, and particularly the abbot of the Abbey of Margam had complained about Herbert's actions against Warwick in March 1450, and complaining that his steward and his officers had far exceeded their authority in the county. In the winter of 1451-1452, that disruption seems to have boiled over into violence, because Warwick, in the January 1452, begins to ship war horses from Warwick and Worcestershire into Glamorgan to defend his possessions. And there begins to be a breakdown of law and order. In August 1452, there is the sacking of Neath Abbey in the west of the lordship of Glamorgan. And the abbot complains that the abbey and its lands have been placed in ruin because of the actions of the men of Glamorgan and the men of Carmarthenshire coming to blows. This situation is exacerbated by Somerset's deputy in Carmarthenshire, Gruffydd ap Nicholas, the most powerful member of the Welsh gentry in that area, who seems to have been a particularly aggressive individual, leading his men into Glamorgan. By July 1453, Herbert and 8 others have been required to appear before the council to answer for their violent conduct. And this is exacerbated on the 27th of July, where a report of their activities arrives at the Privy Council, which actually says that Cardiff and Cowbridge, and particularly Cardiff Castle, are being held in great strength by men as if it were a land at war. By the 2nd of August, Warwick, who has tried to hold on to Cardiff and Cowbridge, which would indicate he's probably lost the western part of Glamorgan, is forced to retreat from the county, and he passes through Ross on the 2nd of August, going back to the Midlands. But Warwick returns by the 20th of August with a retinue of upward of 1,000 men, and recruits at Tewkesbury on the way, including picking up William Herbert at Raglan and his kinship network of the Vaughans of Tretower also. By the time we get to the 27th of August, there are face-offs and violence throughout Glamorgan, so much so that it requires Henry VI to leave Westminster and begin a journey to intervene in person on it. The significance of these events, though, is something that hadn't been recognised previously, because R.L. Story in The Fall of the House of Lancaster attributes the beginnings of the Wars of the Roses to the Neville Percy dispute at Heworth Moor in August of 1453. But at Heworth Moor, though there are large forces deployed on each side, only one person was injured. And the person who was injured at Heworth Moor claimed later for recompense of 60-odd pounds for the injuries that he'd suffered. Whereas for 18 months, Glamorgan is in turmoil, with groups of men, upwards of 1,000, taking part and requiring the direct intervention of firstly the Privy Council and then the King. It's the departure of Henry from Westminster that leads to his mental breakdown, which occurs at the hunting lodge at Clarendon sometime in the early part of September 1453. At that point, Henry is confined by officers of the court and the royal household and eventually spirited back to Windsor, where it subsequently becomes apparent that Henry has suffered what is called an attack of frenzy, seeing him to be completely immobile and completely unable to make any form of relationship with or communicate with anyone whatsoever. It takes two men to move him around and two men to ensure that he eats. This results ultimately in a great council meeting on the 21st of November 1453, when it can't be made obvious anymore that Henry is fit to rule. There is a circumstance where, as soon as the council meets, they summon the Duke of York, who immediately has the Duke of Somerset arrested and taken to the Tower. No charges are brought against Somerset, though. This just seems to be York's animus against Somerset and the charges brought for the previous 2 years. On the 11th of February, York was appointed King's Lieutenant, but the council insisted on the 15th of March that Edward of Westminster, Henry's newly born son, be recognised as the Prince of Wales. And on the 3rd of April, York was appointed Protector of the Realm. However, in West Wales, York's authority is completely ignored by Gruffydd ap Nicholas, who continues as the Duke of Somerset's deputy. This results in a fraying of authority in Wales up until the Christmas of 1454, when Henry recovers his wits. In January of 1454, Henry requires to know what has happened to his cousin, the Duke of Somerset, what has happened to his other cousin, the Duke of Exeter, both of whom have been arrested by York's regime, and they immediately are released because no charges had ever been brought against them. York retires to the north, where he acts in league with Salisbury and Warwick, because Warwick realises that the return of Somerset to power means that it will open both military and judicial pressures on his occupying of his wife's inheritance. That results on the 22nd of May in the Battle of St. Albans, which most people are familiar with. After that, though, what isn't widely known. On the 22nd of June 1455, York assumes Somerset's Welsh offices and appoints himself Constable of Carmarthen, Cardigan and Aberystwyth castles, and occupies the lordship of Builth, which should have been part of the inheritance of the Prince of Wales, for life. This is confirmed by Parliament, which met on the 9th of July of that year. Margaret of Anjou is extremely angry at what she sees to be the usurpation of her son's rights. Not only is his principal castles granted to York for life, but also the ability of her or her son to appoint their own officers is severely constrained. Sorry, I should have put up of St. Albans, but
well, that's what's his name, isn't it?
That's not St. Albans. No, don't worry about that.
It certainly isn't.
In the summer of 1455, though, Margaret and the court react to York's assumption of these offices by just break that up for a moment, by sending Henry's half-brother, his brother uterine, Edmund, Earl of Richmond, to West Wales. Born, roughly speaking, in 1430, Edmund and his brother Jasper were the sons of Owain Tudor. a minor member of the Welsh gentry of Anglesey, and Henry V's widow, Catherine de Valois. Whilst Catherine de Valois could claim lineage going all the way back to Charlemagne, Owain's lineage was much more nebulous than that. And despite later claims, they were never members, the Tudors were never members of the Welsh princely families. Edmund had been granted in 1454 the earldom of Richmond and also the title of Premier Earl of the realm, in which he displaced Warwick from. And not only that, but in the summer of 1455, he was also married to the king's cousin, the 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort, daughter of John, Duke of Somerset. Together in the late summer of 1455, they took up residence in West Wales at the Bishop of St David's Palace of Llanffi. That began a direct royal influence in the affairs of West Wales and saw the beginning of a consolidation of the Tudor presence and the active recruitment of the gentry of West Wales into their retinue. York remained in London as protector of the realm for the second time. And on the 17th of November 1455 brought forward an extremely important petition. He petitioned that the estates of the Prince of Wales should be brought under the control of himself and the council, leaving the prince, who was at this point an infant, with only the territory or only the income due to an infant. This would have excluded Margaret of Anjou and the king from making any decisions regarding their son's property. He also compounded that with an act of resumption against the Tudor brothers as well, wishing to claw back their estates. That meant that York made an enemy for the first time of both Jasper and Edmund Tudor. On the 25th of February 1456, York was removed from the protectorship for the second time. And this led to an outbreak of violence in the marches. Devereux and William Herbert, both brother-in-laws in Herefordshire, attacked Somerset's ally, the Earl of Wiltshire's castle at Orcop on the 3rd of March, and there was significant fighting in Cowbridge on the 12th of April. Edmund had his own problems actually pacifying the Welsh gentry in West Wales, and there's some evidence that he put their noses out of joint. But he established himself in this building here, which is Carmarthen Castle, the central point and governing point of the Principality of South Wales. From there, he began to extend his rule over the whole of South Wales, only to find that this was challenged in the summer when, in June 1456, William Herbert and Richard Herbert began recruiting men at Ross to attack, it was said, the king. This is untrue, and it resulted in Herbert and Devereux bringing together 2,000 men, plus advancing down the Towy Valley and capturing Cardiff Castle. At Carmarthen Castle, they then imprisoned Edmund Tudor in his own dungeons. The effect of this was to have outrage throughout the realm. The majority of the nobility wanted to know under what basis this had been undertaken, under what warrant. Herbert and Devereux tried to weakly defend themselves and say that the appointment of York as the Constable of Carmarthen Castle had been usurped by Edmund Tudor, and that York held it by Act of Parliament. Others believed that this was in the gift of the Prince of Wales and ultimately the king. The situation got much worse, though, on the 3rd of November, when Edmund Tudor died. It was said of the plague, but many people believed that his death was directly attributable to the treatment that he'd suffered during the summer. That had left Edmund's wife, Margaret, on her own at Lamphey until her brother-in-law Jasper arrived on the 28th of by the 28th of January and took her with him into Pembroke Castle. There, she gave birth on the 28th of January on St. Agnes's Day to Henry, son of Edmund, Earl of Richmond, and was then promptly whisked away for another marriage. Taken to Newport, she married Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham's younger brother, on the 6th of April, 1457, her third marriage by the time she got to 14 and a half. The Queen exerted incredible revenge for the death of Edmund Tudor, and a commission of Oyer and Terminer appeared in Hereford on the first week of April, and they brought charges against 397 men, the largest commission of Oyer and Terminer to sit in the 15th century. 285 of the 397 men were proven to be adherents to the Duke of York, and they were arraigned on 114 separate offences. This and the court's reaction meant York was actually then confined once more to a period of political impotence. And this continued until 1459, when his steward, Sir William Oldhall, was arrested for plotting against the king once more. York, in defence of his steward, raised his forces once more in Ludlow in the West Midlands, and after an anabasis that took him around the West Midlands, was forced to surrender at Ludford Bridge on the 12th and the 13th of October. He then was forced into exile, and from exile in Dublin, where he was attainted along with his nephew Warwick, his brother-in-law Salisbury, and his two sons, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and Edward, Earl of March. York's exile allowed for the extension of Jasper Tudor's power out of West Wales for the first time and into North Wales, because Henry gave Jasper in January 1460 control over the lordship of Denbigh. Jasper had to lay siege to the castle of Denbigh until early February of that year to be able to capture it and to establish firmly his control over North Wales. But this was for the first time that Jasper became a figure of note and a figure of Welsh renown that took him beyond the confines of West Wales and his earldom of Pembroke. Jasper's position was within Welsh culture was also endorsed heavily at this time, and he becomes a significant figure of praise for Welsh bardic poetry and a recognition that he himself was someone who had lineage that went back in many ways into the mists of time and into a sense of Welsh identity that had lain dormant since the eclipse and death of Llywelyn the Last in 1282. The situation didn't last though, for whilst Jasper was involved in North Wales, Warwick and the Earl of March landed on the 26th of June at Sandwich to try to reclaim their rights and their estates within England. Subsequently, Warwick was able to defeat the forces of Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton and capture the person of Henry VI. That left Margaret and the young Prince of Wales isolated at Coventry, and Margaret fled across the Midlands into Cheshire, where she was then robbed by one of her servants. And it was only by good fortune that she managed to make herself to North Wales, to Denbigh, where she was welcomed by Jasper and given both hope, subsistence, and effectively protection at that point. York himself had remained in Dublin and didn't return until the 9th of September, when he marched through the Midlands with his sword carried before him as if he was a royal figure. He entered Parliament on the 10th of October, and it is said that he entered it with all the prominent chieftains of the Welsh, reflecting his Mortimer lineage, plus 800 men at his back. He then attempted to make himself king, but that was rejected firstly by the Lords and then effectively by the judges as well. What emerged was the Act of Accord, in which York, it was agreed, would succeed the Henry VI, which in some ways was possibly a forlorn hope since Henry was 10 years younger than York was, and that he would then subsequently be king. This brought into play a dynastic decision and a dimension which had grown out of the conflict that had been exacerbated in South Wales. That dynastic conflict was something that was fueled by Margaret of Anjou summoning to herself all lords who were loyal to Henry VI to meet with her at Hull and launching an invasion of the southern part of England.
Mm-hmm.
That invasion of the southern part of England was also coordinated by two prominent Lancastrians, Jasper Tudor, who recruited in West Wales and held the waterway of Milford Haven, awaiting the presence of the stalwart Lancastrian, the Earl of Wiltshire. Wiltshire had been in the Netherlands at Utrecht recruiting both troops and mercenaries to bring in support of Margaret. And the plan was that they would land in January 1461 in Milford Haven and join up with Jasper Tudor and march into the Midlands to meet with Margaret's army sweeping south. Margaret's army had achieved a great victory over the Yorkists on the 30th of December at Wakefield, where York had effectively been killed, his head cut off and placed over the bar gate of York with a paper crown upon his head. When York had been killed, his 18-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, who had been Warwick's companion in Calais, was at Shrewsbury when he heard of his father's death. He moved south in the new year to Hereford, and by the end of January had recruited over 11,000 men, including Herbert, Devereux, the Vaughans of Tretower, and the Doones, creating the scene for effectively a conflict that would exist between the men of East Wales and the men of West Wales. That division formed the beginnings of an internecine strife that would not possibly be resolved until 1486, 1487. It would become something of a vendetta where families like the Mansells, the Vaughans, the Doones, and others would all lose significant members and would effectively be bound in blood for revenge upon their fellow citizens and in many cases their neighbours. The dynastic conflict that now takes over, though, had its roots in the breakdown of governance under Henry VI and his inability to control the noble rivalries that existed in South Wales between initially Warwick and Somerset, and then York and Tudor. Once those those local rivalries became bolted onto a dynastic issue, it ensured that the realm which had been riven by faction would now become divided by blood. Thank you very much, and I hope, Annie, I've got in within the prescribed time.
You've absolutely got in within the prescribed time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. That was absolutely fascinating. I think it's so interesting to look at that early part of the Wars of the Roses conflicts from such a different viewpoint, looking at it from the Welsh viewpoint. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Stephen? If you do, please put them in the chat where I can find them. And I'm sure many of you have questions. But I would also say, please do still keep yourselves on mute. Any questions coming in the chat?
Yes, I'm just typing one.
Okay.
Or shall I just ask it?
Perhaps you should just ask it since you're here.
Yeah, you quoted this figure of 11,000 men at Shrewsbury. Are you suggesting that's the size of Edward's army at Mortimer's Cross? So how many men's he got at Mortimer's Cross?
I think at Mortimer's Cross he's got about 7,000 or 8,000.
7,000 or 8,000. Okay, and the Tudors?
The Tudors between 5,500 and 6,000.
Of which 4,000 die?
Roughly speaking, 4,000 are rumoured to have died. I think there's an element of hyperbole in the 11,000 and possibly the 4,000, but it's a grievous loss for large sections of the Welsh gentry at Mortimer's Cross.
Okay.
I have some more questions that have come in. Yeah. Graham, sorry, no, it's a question from Jane saying you did not mention Rutland, who was also murdered at Wakefield. Rutland, of course, the Duke of York's second son.
Yes, only because of constraints of time, Annie.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yes.
Of course, I think I'm right in saying that he was taken prisoner in the battle, wasn't he, and killed afterwards.
Well, it's either there's one account which actually says he flees with his military tutor, and that they run down, and that he's subsequently killed, not in the battle. Whether he's a prisoner or not is possibly debatable. There is an account, a chronicler account, that says his gorget was ripped from his throat, and he was stabbed in the throat.
Another question coming in: do we know what illness Henry VI suffered from?
It's regarded by modern analysts as something that it is a complete mental breakdown brought on by the shock of Castillon and the defeat of the English there, and would be described as catatonic schizophrenia in psychological terms.
Yes, that was my understanding too. And one more question, who's asking about some of your PowerPoint slides, I think. Can your slides 5, 6, and 11 be explained? They appear to have been passed over when the screen sharing paused.
Right.
I'm not sure which ones they were.
Six was the Battle of St Albans. 5 was Cardiff Castle, and 11 was Mortimer's Cross. I was going to leave that, Annie, to Katie.
Yes, indeed. We'll be talking a lot about Mortimer's Cross, I'm sure. Thank you. One more question just come in. What is the source for Margaret of Anjou's presence being in? What is the source for Margaret being in Coventry during the Battle of Northampton?
You'll find it in Ralph Griffiths' book, Biography of Henry VI. And Ralph Griffiths makes the assertion that she takes her place at Coventry since it belonged to the Prince of Wales as his town. And that was where Henry was residing and recruiting prior to movement to Northampton. When he moves to Northampton, Margaret remains at Coventry. I can see Graham saying that there isn't a primary source. I'm sure Ralph Griffiths wouldn't have quoted it unless there was a primary source for it.
No, he hasn't got a primary source.
Interesting.
That's why I asked, because when we did the book on Northampton, we couldn't find a solid source for where she was, because she's quoted at being all over the place. So I keep seeking, but I have not yet found. Thank you.
Yeah.
Slippery lady, Margaret of Anjou.
She
was. Any other questions for Stephen? No. Well, Stephen, I'm sure you'll agree that's been an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you so much, Stephen. That's wonderful.
Thank you, Annie, for the opportunity.
You're welcome. And everybody should race out right now and buy Stephen's latest book, The Birth of the Red Dragon, Wales and the Wars of the Roses. From every good bookseller and online. Off you go. As soon as this conference is over, off you go and shop.